Welcome to Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John.
Hey, John.
How are you doing, Ed?
I'm good, thanks. Give us a history lesson.
Yeah, as usual. So we've been talking throughout this series about our inspiration from the Revolutionary War and Thomas Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense. And really the theme that keeps coming back is change. You know, how do you bring about big change, like kicking the British out of the American colonies and starting up a whole new country? That's a big change. And as we've said before, it really didn't come easy. The war itself was very difficult. A lot of people had a hard time, not just with their own lives, but just in figuring out what to do next. So it was interesting that Thomas Paine's idea was to create a constitution for the United States, the upcoming United States, and that was really his idea. But it's also interesting that he didn't want things to turn out the way they did. He didn't want a strong executive branch with a president and two houses of Congress, which would end up being very similar to Britain's parliament. He wanted something else. He wanted just one house of Congress where everyone had an equal vote. And it's interesting, his cohorts at the time disagreed with him, and ultimately he lost the argument to people like Ben Franklin and John Adams. So change is very difficult, and to quote the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. So let's bring this back to business and talk about that big change that many businesses have today. So where do we start with that conversation?
So, we can certainly start by talking about Colin's classic BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal. We could start by talking about the fact that too many companies tend to think in a very incremental and linear way. We could go back to some of the discussion we've had about disruption, how if the markets are substantially changing around companies and they can't just adapt, they have to really do things in a different way. The point is, there's got to be an acceptance of the fact that there's a substantial change and a really aggressive goal that motivates everybody and gives them what they're working toward, doubling revenue over the course of the next 3 years, for instance. Now, it's easy to say double revenue if you're a startup. It's different to say double revenue if you're a $50 million company that's been in business, for the last 30 years. Suddenly doubling revenue is a very different kind of a goal. So clearly, you got to make sure you can scale. You got to make sure there's the right mindset. You got to make sure that people want to change like that. It has to be a goal that's appropriate for the company. But once you've set that, then you need to certainly understand the areas in that revenue growth function that need to change. And sales and marketing strategy for sure is one of them. What do you want to grow, 10% or grow 100%? The way we've sold and marketed for the last 20 years are different than the way we need to going forward if we want to be successful. We've got to have that alignment as this continuum develops where marketing and sales are really part of the same function with slightly different responsibilities at different points on buying circle. There's got to be alignment to make sure that everyone's working together in a way that solves for the buyer. We've got to be agile. We're going to be testing, trying stuff, measuring it, modifying, adapting. It's got to move quickly. There'll be lost opportunities. Prospects are coming to sites now and they want to chat, and they want to chat with somebody immediately. It's not a 24-hour turnaround anymore. It's like a real-time discussion, and that takes an attitude of agility. And culture, probably the biggest, toughest part of all of this is shifting culture from an idea that we kind of moved at a very deliberate pace, conservative, sort of traditional company, and now we need to be very much solving for the buyer. And we need to be moving quickly and focused on always adapting based on buying expectations and based on what the market's expecting of us. And so changing those things in the context of also trying to drive toward a big goal like doubling revenue is hard. I mean, doing either of those independently is hard. Doing them together is tougher. So how would you suggest companies go about doing this, John? How can they pull it off?
Well, I think once you have a pretty good idea of where you want to go, you really need to know where you are now so that you have a good idea of what it's going to take to get there. So I would start with that, some sort of assessment, internal review, if you haven't already done this. And you really need to ask yourself some tough questions like, in general, where are we now relative to this goal? And how big of a change does that look like? Let's dive in a little bit. Over the past 5 years, how much have we changed? How much have we adapted to the reality of the new sales and marketing? How well have we aligned customer service? What do our teams look like, and how well do they operate? Do they work together at all? And let's be honest about that, because sometimes it's difficult to really do that and be objective. And then let's line up or put on a whiteboard things that we could be doing better, and let's try to prioritize those. What are the toughest things that we're running up against, and where do we need to improve the most? Then let's look outside. Let's look at our customer base. How happy are they with not just our products, but with our service, where we're going, the direction we're going, that kind of thing. And you can ask them using surveys. You can talk to them one-on-one. You can find out from each other. There are a lot of different ways, but just try to find out as much as you can about how your customer base is doing right now. And then what does the market look like? What does the future look like for your products and services? How much has that changed? What are your channel partners saying? What's the scuttlebutt out there about where the markets are going? Are we being disrupted like a lot of companies are? And if so, by whom and by what? And then let's get into the planning stage of this a little bit. What are we prepared to spend in terms of time, budget, resources in order to turn these challenges around and reach those goals? And are we even committed to making those kinds of required changes? So, at the end of that conversation with ourselves, we should be ready to go. We should have a plan, and we should be committed to moving forward. But how do we get started with that?
So, a lot depends on how you answer those questions. And the way a second generation company approaches it will be different than the way a kind of a publicly managed company approaches it. Second generation's primary goal is to not screw up what the first generation did. And that's kind of antithetical sometimes to the sort of change that's important to persevere through this sort of a disruption. The understanding where you're starting and understanding where you want to go to give you the basis to begin to figure out how to put together the pieces. You got to have an effective team that's focused on what customers want. You can discuss options and select the organization model and the process that lets you kind of run the company accordingly. I mean, a lot of people these days are talking about EOS as a great way to balance skill sets inside the company and focus on having the right people in the right seats, focused on the right big rock kinds of problems. Maybe it's another kind of a system, but there's got to be a very clear management system that enables this sort of change. That's going to help transform the culture, and it's going to allow a process that aligns the team with the company's goals and working with customers. Then when you get that foundation in place, sales, marketing, and service, they need to get aligned. I mean, we've hammered on that point throughout these discussions. They are different and yet incredibly similar in the context of the customer relationship. And they've got to work from a playbook that understands the way the customer looks at their relationship with the company. It's a continuum of that experience, and we can't disrupt that with the silos anymore. A corollary to that is we understand who the right buyers are, and we stop wasting time chasing bad leads, and we stop ignoring the good ones just because it may sound like one that the sales rep called one time and didn't have success with. Doesn't mean it's not a good lead. And there's too much waste in that lead generation and follow-up process. We got to measure. We've a recurring theme in our conversations. We have to understand the right metrics that we need to track, and we have to understand not just metrics that are informative to us, but metrics that tell us which levers we need to pull and with which magnitude. And so we have to have not only the metrics and the understanding of how to react to them, but we have to have the tools that will allow us to take those measurements and observe them on a regular basis. And that's not going to be a spreadsheet that has copying and pasting every week. It just, there's going to be errors. It's not going to work. And so there has to be an integration of the whole tech stack the way that we've talked about. And the idea that as we make these changes and as we measure, going back to the point on agility, that there is no kind of destination for this. This is a continuous process that will continue not only as we improve against the metrics that we've identified right now, but as buying behaviors change as we're doing that, then the target moves, and we need to continue to adjust for that as well. So that's kind of the basic roadmap for companies that are trying to embrace this sort of change in hopes of growing or at least being viable. Let's circle back now and take this opportunity for you to kind of recap this journey that we've been on. What would you say are some of the biggest common sense takeaways that you want to leave folks with as we wrap up this discussion?
Well, I think the biggest one is really the change in the buyers that are out there. B2B buyers are different from how they used to be just a few years ago. As a result of all the technological changes, the expectations that buyers have with Google and Amazon, things are just different. The complex sale is still complex, but now it's maybe even more complex because we're not in control as sellers anymore. We're really much more reactive. And in order to make that work, we need to take on different roles. So the second big takeaway is the role of sellers. You know, buyers really want experts now to help them when they need help, not before, but when they need it. So they're going to come to us in one way or another. Usually it's online these days. And we need to be ready for that. We need to be highly connected with buyers, with marketers, with customer service professionals so that everyone that the buyer needs is ready to go and has the right information exactly at the right time. And we're talking about seconds now. We're not talking about days, weeks, and months. So, it's really an online, it's 24/7, it's really right now sort of environment. And that's what they want. That's what buyers want. And they're often going to choose that best buyer experience. It's not so much just about who has the best product anymore or even the best service. It's really about that entire process that the buyer goes through when they, are considering and finally purchasing your products. So the next takeaway is really what to do about that. It's a mindset. We've talked about a change of culture. It's an agility that you just talked about. So organizations really need to think about that and realign and sort of reorganize in order to meet that purpose, to meet the buyer's needs, to be there when they need to be there. And that's going to take change, as we've just discussed. It's going to take service level agreements among different groups, maybe some reorganization. It's going to take new processes. It's going to take technology. And it's going to take measurement through metrics. So all of those things are big changes. And the question is, well, do we need to do that right now? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, failure to make these changes can be devastating, as bad as really losing market share, as losing your best people. It's devastating to also fall behind just because you're not set up to solve for the customer these days.
The trick may be, though, that often that's a gradual decay. And
yeah.
If you lose a key employee, there's a clear line of demarcation. We need to address that. We need to respond. But if you just kind of don't progressively solve for the buyer the way some competitors are, it doesn't happen overnight. And it's hard to see that, isn't it?
I think it is. But you're probably further behind than you think. So in terms of urgency, yeah, I mean, it's a gradual change, but it's already been gradually changing for a while now. So
Right.
I would say we all need to get on board faster than we probably think. And I think it was W. Edwards Deming who said, it's not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory.
Ouch.
You know, it's easy to try to scare people into making changes, but all you got to do is look around you. You know, your own competitors are probably doing some of this at least. And
At the same time, I mean, a great quote from Upton Sinclair, it's hard to convince a man to do something when his salary depends on not changing.
Yeah.
You know, so in many cases, you get sales and marketing departments that are really ossified. And if the CEO recognizes this and the mid-level managers don't, then that comes back to this cultural challenge.
Right, and it's going to be important for leaders to recognize that and to have the courage and conviction to make those changes, and some of it's going to be painful probably.
Right.
So that kind of wraps it up for us on this journey, and Ed and I wanted to thank you all for joining us. As we've said quite a few times, change isn't easy, but if you do it in a rational, structured way with a process, and you do it in phases over time, you can minimize some of that pain. And we hope you'll stay in touch with us as you transform your business. And we'll be following up this series with some more insights and tips and things like that along the way. So with that, I'll say thanks for joining us at Common Sense. I'm John.
And I'm Ed. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it, John.
Me too, Ed.